British justice system is the envy of the world. But in the past, mistakes have been made.
Between the year 1900 and the year 1964, approximately 800 people were hanged in the United Kingdom. Many of those desperately protested their innocence.
Some of these long-standing convictions could be a miscarriage of justice.
She's been assaulted with a weapon, and there's been more than one blow.
In this series, a living relative will attempt to clear their family name.
I remember to this day my grandmother saying he didn't do it, his dad did it.
Searching for new evidence.
It would have been impossible for that injury to have occurred during a struggle.
With help from two of the UK's leading barristers, one for the defence.
There is a world of difference between an unpleasant journey and murder.
And one for the prosecution.
He cut off her head, dismembered her, and buried her in a place where he hoped she would never be found.
They're on a mission to solve a mystery, submitting their findings to a Crown Court judge.
Your Honour ought to declare the conviction for murder to be unsafe.
Thank you both for your submissions. I shall consider these matters for myself.
Can this modern investigation rewrite history? At 3 o'clock on a summer's morning in 1893, gentleman farmer William Masfen left his home to confront poachers on nearby farmland. It was the last time he was seen alive. At 9:30, his body was discovered lying face down in a ditch. He'd been shot twice and bludgeoned. Around him were clear signs of a struggle. Police officers traced boot prints they found at the scene to the nearby home of 19-year-old miner John Hewitt, a renowned local poacher. Hewitt was swiftly arrested and charged with murder, an accusation he initially denied. After a trial that lasted just one day, John Hewitt was found guilty. On the 15th of August 1893 at Stafford Jail, just 6 weeks after William Masfen's death, John Thomas Hewitt was hanged.
So here's John Thomas,
Yes.
executed at Stafford Jail, aged
Yes.
19 years, 8 months and 15 days.
That's right.
Yes.
Today, well over a century later, John Hewitt's relatives Adrian and his father Trevor want to find out the truth about what transpired that morning and whether their ancestor might be innocent.
We came over from Australia in 1988 for an extended holiday, and I met up with my grandparents. We were working out a family tree, and as we came to the Hewitt side, my grandmother's side of the family, we came across John Hewitt, and that's when they told me. They said, oh, he was hanged for murder.
Adrian's seeking clarity on a family legend that's been passed down through the generations.
I remember to this day my grandmother saying, but he never done it. He never done it. It's a family secret. He was the black sheep of the family, but he didn't do it. His dad did it.
His father was never investigated, and John Hewitt was executed aged just 19. But could it have been a miscarriage of justice? And can a modern legal team cast the conviction in a new light? Jeremy Dean QC is one of the UK's most respected defence barristers. Looking at the case for the prosecution is Sasha Wass QC, who has both defended and prosecuted some of the country's highest profile defendants. Adrian has come to London to meet with Sasha and Jeremy, who will be re-investigating John Hewitt's case.
Adrian.
Hello. How
Nice
you
to
doing?
meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Sasha.
Hello.
Hi there, Jeremy.
G'day,
Good to
Jeremy.
meet
How
you.
you doing?
How is it that you've come to believe that John Hewitt said that his father had committed the
From my grandmother. She told us that it was her mother had gone to visit him in the cell, and it was in the cell that he admitted to her that, or told her that his father had actually committed.
And how long ago were you given this information?
In 1988. We did come across a newspaper article where the heading read something like, "Family says the correct man was hanged," which led us to believe there must have been some sort of uncertainty even at the time. But certainly my grandmother was definitely of the belief that he was innocent.
Jeremy and I are going to go away now and look at all angles and all evidence that we can get hold of. And hopefully we'll come back and have some news for you.
John Hewitt was born in rural Staffordshire in 1873 into a working-class family. The second oldest of 9 children, he followed in his father's footsteps and worked as a miner in a local pit. His family were extremely poor and would often go poaching, shooting rabbits. But was John Hewitt responsible for killing William Masfen?
Sasha, this is the case of John Hewitt. It concerns a fatal shooting in rural Staffordshire in 1893. At 3 a.m. on the 1st of July, 29-year-old farmer William Masfen was on land he had hunting rights for. He'd been tipped off that poachers were illegally hunting, and he was there to challenge them. While lying in wait, 19-year-old miner John Hewitt crossed his path. He was holding a recently killed rabbit and a loaded 12-bore, double-barreled shotgun. There was an altercation. The gun was discharged twice. Police found footmarks in the ground. They traced those footprints from the murder scene directly to the door of John Hewitt's family home. When they got there, they found a rabbit in the pantry. They saw John Hewitt's shotgun. John Hewitt was charged with the willful murder of William Masfen. He was found guilty, and as a consequence, John Hewitt was hanged.
We know William Masfen sustained a gunshot wound to his side from a discharge of about 8 yards. And we know also that he sustained a second shot at the back of his head at point-blank range. But I think it's really important that we consult a modern-day firearms expert to ascertain whether the ballistics evidence given at trial is something that we can rely on today.
Sasha, I certainly agree that that's a line of inquiry we need to pursue.
Well, let's get to work.
In stark social contrast to John Hewitt, 29-year-old gentleman farmer William Masfen was a pillar of the local community. Married with a young child, he was a keen sportsman and renowned boxer. Masfen had shooting rights over local Hull farm, which he protected fiercely. Today, Hewitt's descendants, Adrian and Trevor, want to find out more about how the murderous morning unfolded. So the pair have come to Cannock Chase, the scene of the crime, to meet historian Roger Knowles, who's an expert on the case.
It happened here, just where we're standing, just a few, about 100 yards or so from here. Unfortunately, the landscape has changed dramatically over that period.
On Friday, the 30th of June, 1893, William Masfen received a tip-off from an unlikely source.
John Hewitt's friend went to William Masfen and said, they're going poaching.
All right.
In the early hours of tomorrow. And of course, Masfen had taken the Hewitts to court on various occasions for poaching on his land.
William Masfen woke at 3 a.m. to go and confront the poachers.
The gardener said to him, "Shall I come with you for support?" And he says, "No, it's only those Hewitt chaps. I've caught them before. I'm going to get them again."
At trial, the prosecution alleged that John Hewitt had been out poaching in the early hours of the morning and had shot a rabbit. Masfen was lying in wait when Hewitt crossed his path and a bloody confrontation ensued. It was claimed Hewitt first shot Masfen from a distance, then bludgeoned him with the butt of the gun, before firing a second shot into the back of his head.
Of the injuries that he had, in fact, anyone could have killed him, and he was probably dead by the time that second shot took place.
By 8 o'clock that evening, John Hewitt was arrested and taken into custody. He initially protested his innocence, and a local legend was born.
The villagers were convinced that it was John's father that had shot Masfen, and that John had been put up to taking the rap because he was so young. They thought that he wouldn't get a death sentence, he'd just be sentenced to so many years in prison.
The fact that my mother said immediately when I told her that I'd discovered the story that he didn't do it, you know, was not just a personal thing, but everyone in the village was of the same opinion.
Of the same opinion, yes.
That's right.
Yes.
No passers-by saw the murder. But can the witness statements gathered shed more light on the nature of the deadly confrontation.
Well, Jeremy, this is a map of the area where everything happened. We can see where William Masfin's house was. The Hewitts lived a little way away, up here, and then between those two distances, we see where the body of William Masfin was found. Now, when we look at witness accounts, we really have to go back to the evening before. And the first witness of significance was a young man called George Pearce. Now, George Pearce went out with John Hewitt the night before, poaching. They tried to shoot a rabbit about 10 o'clock, but failed. At the same time that John Hewitt was poaching, John Brooke, who was the gardener to William Masfin, was out shooting legitimately with William Masfin. And shortly after they returned home, which was just after about 10 o'clock, they hear the shot coming from Hole Farm. So Masfin, realising that there must be poachers on his land, leaves in the direction of Hole Farm at about 3 o'clock. Now, at about 3:15, the witness called William Reed wakes up to do his early morning lawn mowing. He leaves his house at 3:15, and at 3:30, he hears the first of 2 shots. The second shot, he says, takes place about 15 minutes after the first.
Well, Sasha, it's well documented that witnesses who give evidence of this type of incident can get timing badly wrong. What is of note is that Police Sergeant Upton, when he examined the crime scene, states that the grass on the opposite side of the fence to the ditch was trampled as if there had been a struggle. And that's a really important point, of course.
Well, this incident may have been considerably more dynamic than the prosecution suggested and involved a certain amount of struggling between the two men.
The Hewitts were driven to poaching by poverty, but how common were altercations between poachers and gamekeepers? Adrian and Trevor are meeting social historian Dr. Rosemary Mudge.
Rosemary, can you tell us about the social situation that made a lot of people go rabbit poaching at the time?
John Hewitt will have been poaching primarily because they were poor, and so it will have been a welcome addition to their diet to have a rabbit every now and again to add to it.
How common was poaching violence at the time?
It was very common. From about 1750 to about 1870, poaching violence was so common that it was sometimes referred to as the poaching wars. It was generally fights between gangs of night poachers and gamekeepers who were out. So poaching violence was common, but it was very uncommon for it to rise in the sort of situation you've got here. I mean, that is such a minor incident, and it's a real puzzle to think how it ended up turning into such a major incident.
As this major incident played out, Police Sergeant Upton was quick to trace boot prints from the scene of the crime to John Hewitt's house, where he was swiftly arrested. A post-mortem revealed Masfin had been shot twice. But was it John or his father who pulled the trigger? Sasha and Jeremy want to examine the impact of the ballistics and find out if a modern interpretation of the injuries can offer any new clues. They're meeting forensic firearms expert Mark Mastaglio.
Sasha.
So this is the type of gun of the era, not the exact one.
Indeed. This type of weapon is a 12-bore caliber shotgun. And that is indeed the caliber of a shotgun the defendant claimed to have had.
We have 2 separate injuries. We have an injury to the side of the torso.
Yes.
Could you demonstrate on our model here?
Yep, on the right side. So the arm must have been raised because we have some pellet impacts in this area of the body.
Under
so
the arm.
clearly the arm could not have been down in the down position. So the arm must have been raised, and the distribution of the shot extends about 8 to 9 inches
Yes.
On the back and round the side of the right-hand side of the trunk.
Can I then come to the distance?
Yes.
From the body, the place
Yes.
of impact, to the end of the barrel?
Yes.
The expert at trial, William Ford,
Yes.
used a distance of about 8 yards.
Indeed.
Do you agree with that?
Well, he had the benefit of having the actual gun, and he tested the gun at several ranges.
Yes.
And he was able to reproduce that distribution of about 8 to 9 inches at 8 yards.
So it's not a situation of hand-to-hand combat, if you like?
It would have been impossible for that injury to have occurred during a struggle.
Of course, your expertise doesn't extend to discounting the possibility that the person with the gun perceived the deceased as being a threat to him, let's say, for example, by coming towards him at the time the gun was fired.
Well, of course, I can't make any comment on that.
Can I then come to the other injury?
So it's described by the surgeon at the time as being at the rear, the left side of the head, below the ear.
Yes.
Extending downwards and forwards. And it's also described as being an extremely disruptive injury.
Yes.
The entire back of the head has been disrupted, the skull has been disrupted and fractured. And there's also tearing of the skin. And this is indicative, from a wound ballistics point of view, from a very close range shot, if not even touching
Right.
the back of the head.
Right. By the time that second shot was fired, there can only have been one intention on behalf of the person who wielded that gun, and that was to kill him.
Whilst in custody, John Hewitt initially denied the charge. Then 48 hours after Masfin's death, he made a dramatic statement to Police Sergeant Upton, admitting to the crime. But could this confession have been coerced? Adrian and Trevor have come to a local archive to read Sergeant Upton's witness report of John Hewitt's revelation.
The witness at the time said he went to his cell at 3:25 a.m. to see if he was all right. The witness called through the trapdoor several times, but there was no answer. On going into the cell, he found the prisoner lying down with a rug over him. He called, got no reply, and gave the rug a slight pull. The prisoner then raised his head and, on being asked if he was all right, said yes. He was very sad, and apparently he had been crying.
On turning to leave, he told the prisoner to knock if he wanted anything, and the prisoner said, "I'm all right. I would like to know how you think this job will go." The witness said it depended on how it was done, and that he'd heard of cases where men had been shot in poaching affrays while struggling with a gun. And the prisoner said, "That's just how this job happened."
After Sergeant Upton's comment, John Hewitt made two short statements which frame Masfin's death as a tragic accident.
He says he was just going to get over the rails when Masfin came out from the cart shed and wanted to take the gun off me. I refused to let him take it. He then tried to take it off me. We were wrestling together when the gun accidentally went off, hitting him in the head. The dead rabbit that was found at my father's house was one that I had shot before I met with Mr. Masfin, and he wanted the rabbit off me and the gun. I told him he could have it, but not the gun. The above statement is the truth and nothing but the truth. In a later statement just afterwards, he said that I struck Masfin on the head with the butt of the gun after the first shot, which hit him in the back. Well, it's new information. I mean, we've just had the bare bones, but to get this sort of information that's behind the scenes about he was feeling, it looked like he'd been crying, and that there was this emotional stuff going on, it just adds another layer, another level to our knowledge.
My mother said, "But he didn't do it." And then she followed that by saying, "But your granny went to see him in jail, and he told her that it was the father that did it." Now, why would he drop his father into the trouble when he himself was already under the charge? And she might have come home and told everybody else in the village, and that's where the story came from.
Yeah, it might have been, yes.
It might have been Granny that got it wrong.
Hewitt's confession contradicts Adrian and Trevor's family story, and they can now draw a line under the theory that John's father was responsible. The trial took place on Wednesday, the 26th of July, 1893. and the prosecution claimed Hewitt carried out the killing in cold blood. But was it that straightforward? And can a modern psychological perspective shed new light on the confession? The barristers are meeting clinical psychologist, Dr. Roberta Babb.
If one assumes, for the sake of this discussion, that John Hewitt was attacked by William Masfen, and John Hewitt killed him accidentally, how do you read the state of mind of a 19-year-old in those circumstances with the authorities pressing a murder charge?
One could suggest that he was in shock. The reality is this man's facing a very, very serious charge and he's in shock. I think the thing that I found interesting was in the statement there was a lack of emotion. Normally when people are really upset or worried or really trying to sort of protest their innocence, there's a real sense of I didn't do it. And actually, there's nothing that comes across emotional within the confession. It feels very matter-of-fact, quite thin at times.
You've talked about the lack of emotion in the statement. Could that be because the picture we should have of him is of a young boy in shock, in custody, not legally represented, who wasn't in a fit state to fully advance his case?
Most definitely. I mean, before the officer took the statement, he went into John's cell and he was crying. He was very visibly upset. He may not really fully understand the ramifications of what he's doing. And actually, that's not coming through in terms of the emotions from the statement.
One of the problems is that if the statements he made read callously, i.e. without emotion, that kind of chimes with the allegation.
Exactly, that he's an antisocial criminal that deserves to be hanged.
Considering that these two short statements were the platform for his case, does that make you feel uncomfortable about his conviction?
Most definitely. It makes me feel really uncomfortable and quite sad as well.
You've been asked the $50,000 question by Jeremy, do you feel uncomfortable about the safety of the conviction? With a view to this confession, you haven't studied the firearms evidence, the evidence of what was found at the scene, evidence of footsteps, any of that. You're just basing it on the confession.
Based on the confession only, yes.
In 1893, the law prevented defendants from giving evidence in front of the jury. So the written confession was the only time John Hewitt's account was heard, and it formed the backbone of both the prosecution and defence cases. Adrian and Trevor have come to Staffordshire Shire Hall, where the trial took place.
Well, we're sitting here finally in the Stafford Courthouse, where John went to trial. In fact, he was standing right here behind us, facing the judge. And I've got the Lichfield Mercury here from Friday, July the 28th, 1893. The newspaper report has got a lot of the detail of John's defence solicitor's summing up of the thing. And one of the things I found interesting was he was trying to say that it could have been Masfin's fault for even attempting to take the gun off him.
Yeah. He was apparently not entitled to take the gun because that would be robbery and taking someone else's possessions.
Yes, the defence solicitor said if the deceased took the law into his own hands and tried to take the gun, he was doing a wrong act, and the prisoner would be entitled to use all proper means of resistance.
Yeah.
There were also apparently marks or a struggle on the grass that they preserved, and it's not unlikely that the gun could have gone off during the struggle and that the second head blow injury could have been in passion.
They're trying to say it was manslaughter, not murder.
Yeah.
The jury deliberated for just 20 minutes and returned a verdict of guilty. After issuing the death sentence, the trial judge took the unusual step of writing to the Home Secretary, expressing his concerns about the case. Sasha and Jeremy are studying this very letter.
The judge underlined his opinion, if not anxiety, when he wrote to the Home Secretary approximately 1 week before John Hewitt was hanged, expressing the view that apart from the prisoner's statement, the evidence was wholly insufficient to convict. So the judge clearly was of the view that all the prosecution had against John Hewitt was his confession.
The difficulty I have with this confession is that it is relied on by the defence during the closing speech of John Hewitt's counsel. What the defence counsel said, The prisoner bitterly regrets the acts, and the death of the deceased was brought about in a struggle for possession of the gun, and there was no deliberate intention on behalf of the prisoner to kill the deceased. This is manslaughter, not murder.
Of course, defence counsel was driven to rely on the confession because it was in before the jury. Without the confession, there would have been no evidence against John Hewitt at all.
I'm not sure that's right. We know that John Hewitt was in possession of exactly the same type of firearm that caused the death of William Masfen. And we know he was using that loaded firearm on William Masfen's land within hours of William Masfen's death. The footprints found in the mud matched the shoe print of John Hewitt exactly. Now, that is very strong evidence. I am troubled by the fact that a confession or an admission, partial admission, was elicited from a 19-year-old in police custody without the assistance of legal advice. However, I'm also troubled by aspects that militate against it being unreliable.
Well, we'll both have to reflect on our individual standpoints and decide how we put this matter before Judge Radford.
John Hewitt was executed on the 15th of August, 1893, just 6 weeks after the murder. Adrian and Trevor have come to Stafford Prison to meet Officer Stephen Edwards and see the old execution chamber, which is now an office.
John Hewitt was the first man to be executed in this room. The day of the execution, he'd been brought into this chamber. As soon as he arrived on the trapdoor, his hands would have been bound behind his back, the rope would have been put on, the noose put on, and the lever would have been pulled, and down he'd have gone. And the death was instantaneous by separating the bones in the neck.
Yes.
Well, gentleman behind you, the silver cup, if you want to pick it up, and the base as well. It's two separate pieces. This was the chalice that was used in the condemned cell. You know, it's a very important piece of history.
Yes, definitely.
All executed men and women executed in Stafford from 1845 would have used this chalice.
Sure.
Should they've taken last rites or communion wine prior to execution, including John Hewitt himself.
With Judgment Day imminent, Sasha and Jeremy have discovered a letter written by John Hewitt in the days before his death, which potentially casts his previous confession in a new light.
Well, Jeremy, on Friday the 11th of August, he wrote a letter to his aunt and uncle, which was quite moving. It's a long letter, very articulate and very clear. I was in a passion when the deed was done. My passions were too strong for me. Mr. Masfen could not hold me at all, but still he would not give in. I wish he had given in. It would have been all the better for me, and I should not be in prison now.
Well, Sasha, I think this letter is important because it shows that John Hewitt genuinely believed that he'd been acting out of passion. In other words, as I read it, in self-defence. In fact, slightly earlier in the letter, he said this: "I should not have done it if he had not started to take the gun off me. I asked him to let me be. I said, 'You know my name, and why not let me go?' He said, 'I shall not let you go until you have given me the gun.'" The foundation for a case of self-defence is laid out there, in my view, and contrasts starkly with the surgical atmosphere of the confession clearly made in difficult circumstances at the police station. And who knows, if the jury had had a more humane statement from John Hewitt, whether they might have seen the case on a more humane basis, i.e. manslaughter at worst.
Following his execution, John Hewitt was buried in the grounds of Stafford Jail. Stephen is showing Adrian and Trevor where their ancestor was laid to rest.
So we're in 20 foot, maybe 30 foot of John's last resting place.
Yeah.
So I'll just leave you here to have a few minutes to talk amongst yourselves and think about things. OK?
Thank you. Thanks, Steve.
Right. I never thought I'd be here.
Yeah, it's where it all ended, isn't it?
When I first came over and was doing the family tree, going around to the local graveyards and reading the headstones of the family, to think that there was one that you would never get to see.
Yes.
And to actually be on the site where he's potentially buried within 10 feet or so, it's quite an amazing experience, I think.
Sasha and Jeremy have now finished their legal investigation and must present their arguments before Judge Radford.
The two important features of this case are, number one, whether there is any evidence that the police extracted this confession in a way that was either unfair or oppressive, and number two, whether there is any additional evidence putting John Hewitt at the scene of the crime.
John Hewitt was convicted of murder based on a confession made in the early hours of the morning. That confession should, in my view, never have been ruled admissible.
Adrian is attending the judgment without his father Trevor. Today is his opportunity to challenge the safety of John Hewitt's conviction, 126 years after the execution.
I'm hoping for a verdict that it was an unsafe conviction. It certainly would be a fitting resolution to 30 years of family research.
Adrian, hello.
Nice to meet you.
Good to see you again.
Good to see you again. How are you feeling about today?
I'm looking forward to the judgment, to see what eventuates and what comes out of it.
Are you hopeful?
Yes, it'd be interesting if it's an unsafe conviction, yes.
All right, well, I think the judge is more or less ready for us now, so if you'd like to follow Sasha, we'll go into the judge's room.
With over 14 years' experience as a senior Crown Court judge, David Radford has presided over some of the UK's most infamous trials. And he will be treating this case like any other.
Please sit down. We are here today for me to inquire into the safety of the conviction of John Thomas Hewitt. Mr. Dean, would you like to start?
Your Honour, following the trial judge wrote to the Home Secretary indicating that, in his view, the only evidence to connect John Hewitt with this crime was an alleged confession. It's my submission that the confession is one which can only be described as manifestly unreliable. John Hewitt had been taken into custody, and the scene that is set by Police Sergeant Upton is a stark and disturbing one. At approximately 3:25 a.m., so in the depth of night, John Hewitt is described as being very sad and apparently had been crying. Not ideal circumstances in which to be induced to make a confession to murder, which is precisely what occurred. Mr. Upton said in his statement that John Hewitt said, quote, "I should like to know how you think this job will go on." And then, according to Mr. Upton, he said that he'd heard of cases where men had been shot in poaching affrays while struggling with a gun. So he's putting it in his mind. And apparently, John Hewitt responds by saying, "That's just how this job happened." Now, what followed is just a few lines in which John Hewitt said, amongst other things, "We were then wrestling together when the gun accidentally went off, hitting him in the head." In the course of this inquiry, we've had assistance from Dr. Roberta Babb, a clinical psychologist, who, when considering the alleged confession, remarked at how stark it was. No emotional input whatsoever. The confession was sanitized, it lacked emotion. The terms of it may well have prejudiced him in that the jury might have said to themselves, he's a heartless soul, when the reality is that this confession could well have come about at the behest of police officers in the most unreliable of circumstances. It's true that his counsel said to the jury that this amounted to his defence. What I say is that this had to be his defence because it had been created
and it therefore became impossible for him to move away from it in the circumstances he was lumbered with it. So, for all the reasons given, I submit that this 1893 conviction for murder should be regarded by Your Honour as unsafe.
Thank you, Mr. Dean, for your eloquent submissions.
Thank you, Your Honour.
Yes, Ms. Wass, in response.
Your Honour, the modern-day firearms expert, Mark Mastaglio, has provided evidence that whoever fired those shots at William Masfen intended to kill him. The first shot was one to the side of Masfen's body, and that shot was fired at a distance of 8 yards, not consistent with any struggle trying to get hold of the gun. The second shot is wholly inconsistent with any issue of self-defence, being, as it was, to the back of the head at point-blank range. The issue at trial was, therefore, who was it that fired those shots? Now, when police reached the scene, they found a series of footprints from the site of William Masfen's body, which led directly to the Hewitt house. At the Hewitt house, they found a shotgun and, most importantly, a comparison between the footprints found which led them to the Hewitt house matched exactly with John Hewitt's boot. And as a result of that information, they arrested and charged John Hewitt with the murder of William Masfen. Let me turn to the confession of John Hewitt, which is really the basis of Mr. Dean's submissions today. This was not an officer who went to the cell and woke up a sleeping man demanding a confession. The first engagement of conversation was that the prisoner, so John Hewitt, said, "I should like to know how you think this job will go on." So it is Hewitt who engages the officer in a conversation about the quality of the evidence. And then the officer said something which I accept was extremely unwise, namely venturing an opinion that he, the officer, had heard of cases where poachers had struggled with a gun, etc., etc. And at that stage, Hewitt said, "That's just how it happened." Now, the statement was, in the main, exculpatory, because what it outlines is a fracas between the two men, John Hewitt and William Masfen, where, according to Hewitt in this statement, the gun was discharged entirely accidentally. And had that been accepted by the jury, it would have resulted in a not guilty verdict. Mr. Dean and I have had the opportunity of looking at a letter that was written on the 11th of August, 1893, so after the trial, but before John Hewitt's execution. And what Mr. Hewitt says to his aunt and uncle was this: "I was in a passion when the deed was done. My passions were too strong for me. Mr. Masfen could not hold me at all, but still he would not give in. I wish he had given up. It would have been the better for me, and I should not have been in prison now." So what John Hewitt was explaining to his aunt and uncle was effectively that he lost his self-control, during the course of which he caused the death of William Masfen.
Well, thank you.
Can I, if I may, just reply briefly to one point arising from the letter Ms. Wass has referred to? I submit that the letter is capable of being consistent with an assertion of accident or self-defence. And finally, that there is at least some semblance of feelings of emotion and passion in the letter, which is missing from the confession, that could well have led the jury to reject it for the reasons I've already discussed with Your Honour.
Thank you both of your submissions. I'm going to consider them, and in due course I will let you know my view of the matter, if you're kind enough to allow me some time.
Thank you.
To do that.
The submissions have now been put before Judge Radford. But have Sasha and Jeremy done enough to advocate their opposing views?
You've heard, obviously, now about the circumstances in which John Hewitt is said to have confessed. Do those circumstances trouble you?
To an extent. I think the ballistics evidence that you've put forward and give a lot of credence to is true. It's irrefutable based on the body. And your evidence of the confession can be interpreted as being unsafe.
The judge is considering all the various points. We'll have to wait and see what he finds.
Yeah.
Was John Hewitt's confession improperly obtained nearly 130 years ago? Or is the damning circumstantial evidence enough to uphold the conviction? Judge Radford is ready to deliver his verdict.
Miss Wass has argued before me that given the cogent circumstantial evidence that it was Mr. Hewitt who was the shooter and not anyone else, and she further submits the trenchant expert ballistics evidence at trial given by the prosecution's firearms expert, whose conclusions are not challenged by the modern-day expert Mr. Mastaglio. Mr. Dean submits that the defence explanation at trial of accidental shooting was one born of what he says was an unreliable account given to Police Constable Upton in the cell. The explanation was not proved, in my judgment, to be a reliable and true confession, given the circumstances in which it was prompted and obtained, and its manifest controversion as being a true confession by the ballistics evidence. I agree with Mr. Dean that the defendant was then lumbered with that explanation, as in truth, so was his defence counsel. Not surprising that the jury found that it was not one which was consistent with the evidence otherwise that they heard. At the end of the day, and not without some hesitation, I have judged that the conviction was unsafe. In any event, I would add, the failure to commute the death sentence was an unmerciful one. I shall rise.
Take a seat.
Well, first of all, how are you feeling about?
Well, quite pleased, actually. In retrospect, it's been a long journey to get to this. When hearing the words that it was an unsafe conviction, I'm pleased. And I specifically like the comment about it was unmerciful, the fact that the sentence wasn't commuted.
Exactly.
Very few people would disagree with that.
I was quite amazed by that verdict. And from my grandmother's point of view, she always said that he didn't do it. And to hear today that it was an unsafe conviction, she would be simply, I can imagine her now, simply sitting at the table saying, I told you so.